Right. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I've actually prepared a long paper, fully written out, one of the few occasions where I've completed a paper before the conference. So I, of course, won't be able to cover all of it. But please forgive me if I read from time to time from the paper. When Dr. Farooq asked me to present a paper on progressive Islam, I thought it was quite coincidental, because for some time I was thinking about writing about this. And that might be, and the reason why I think will become clear to you. Now, the idea of progressive Islam, or its variant, progressive Muslims, is generally held to be a notion that developed in the West, particularly after 9/11. Although it was used earlier in the 1990s, but it did not appear very often in the 1990s, but it began to appear a lot after 2001. Various Islamic organizations and movements have emerged. For example, you have the Progressive Muslim Union of North America. You have Muslims for Progressive Values. The idea of progressive Islam, one of the early expressions was made by Professor Omid Safi, who is an American-based Iranian scholar, about 15 years ago or so. Progressive Muslim thought is also associated with this UK-based journal, Critical Muslims. I think some of you know about the journal. It's also associated with the Australian-based, who used to be in Singapore, Adis Dujerida, who is now in Australia. He used to be at the University of, did I say Singapore? University of Malaya in gender studies. But I think what is interesting for me is that it had hardly been recognized that the idea of progressive Islam actually emerged in the Malay world. And this was in the 1950s. It was the name of a journal started by Syed Hussein Alatas called Progressive Islam. The journal was called Progressive Islam. And it was published while he was a student at the University of Amsterdam. It was published for 2 years, 1954 to 1955. Unfortunately, we as Malaysians, we cannot claim that we started it, because at that time my father was an Indonesian citizen and he became Malaysian a few years after that. But anyway, it comes from our part of the world. But it's not that it's important, that we want to claim that it is ours and not somebody else's. But it's interesting to note, I think, that we have played a role in this. So what I'd like to do is to say a little bit about what progressive Islam means, how it is defined, and then make a few concluding remarks. So progressive Islam, the term progressive Islam probably first appeared in the form of a monthly publication for about 2 years, between 1954 and 1955 in Amsterdam. The editorial of the first issue of the first volume states the following: "This monthly, which we have called Progressive Islam, is the realization of an attempt to formulate a serious view concerning the nature of Islam and its relation with modern thought. The condition of the Muslim people, the nature of the Islamic religion, and the impact of Western thought upon the societies of the East shall be the primary concern of this monthly." And then the editorial goes on to explain why the term progressive Islam. And I think this is very important, because you can imagine if the media picks up on this in Malaysia, the term will be criticized, just as liberal Islam is being criticized, right? So this needs to be clarified. So according to the editorial, the name progressive Islam does not imply any dissection whatsoever as to the nature of the Islamic faith. The idea which we intend to convey is not a kind of abstraction from the totality of the Islamic religion. By calling this paper Progressive Islam, we do not mean that we have extracted one part of Islam which is progressive and left the other part of Islam which is not progressive. Rather, the name progressive Islam should be regarded as another way of saying that Islam is progressive. In other words, the stress is that Islam is progressive by saying progressive Islam. It's not to say that there is also a regressive Islam which we reject. So I think this point is very important, because if we don't say it first, the authorities are going to say that we are making that claim. Because this is typical of the very low standard of discourse in Malaysia on Islam. Low standard and mischievous discourse. Now, apart from dealing with the prejudices and misunderstandings about Islam in the West, and don't forget, this is the time when, in the 1950s, when there were relatively very few Muslim students from the Muslim world studying in the West. So in Indonesia, 1954, this is just a few years after the independence of Indonesia, there were more and more Indonesian students going to study in the Netherlands. There was a lot of far less understanding of Islam in the Netherlands those days. So very much in the minds of Muslim students there was the issue of the misunderstanding of the West towards Islam. So that was one of the aims of the monthly Progressive Islam. Now, the editorial of the second issue, called "The Regeneration of Islamic Societies," lists 5 fundamental problems faced by the Muslim world: the nature of the group in power, the lack of sound planning, unconsciousness of the vital problems of society, negative influences from the West, and materialism and positivism. So these are sort of the 5 issues that Progressive Islam considered to be important. Now, even then, we see that Syed Alatas was very concerned with the problem of leadership. And there's an interesting quote from the second issue of Progressive Islam about the problem of leadership. And you can see it really applies to us today. It had been a deeply felt misfortune amongst the people of Islam that the group that is usually in power from amongst themselves are people who neither are inspired by the lofty humanitarian ideals of Islam nor by any sense of proportion. These people abused the trust invested in them by the community and shamefully raped the good name of Islam by claiming to be its followers. No amount of correct thinking will convince them about the necessity of promoting the general welfare. As we all are aware, it is not merely the presence of knowledge that induces a man to do a certain thing. What is more important still is the proper psycho-emotional attitude in which all strivings and thinking is rooted. The only way left to us is to find adequate means to relieve these type of people from the responsibility of leadership. Well, this is a student speaking, in very optimistic terms. 70 years later, we are still trying to relieve this type of leadership from their responsibility, but we have not made any progress. Just to continue the last line of the quote, signs are not wanting that the people of Islam have become conscious of this fact and are trying its best to change the composition of its leadership. Now, according to the monthly Progressive Islam, the backwardness of Muslim society is in a large part due to the deficiencies found within the Muslim world. But there was a balance in terms of the concern with external and internal factors, which as I will claim later, is one of the distinguishing features of Progressive Islam as opposed to other orientations among Muslims. So I've said a little bit about the ideas of Progressive Islam as it was envisaged by Syed Alatas. Now, just a few points about its method. So regarding the method of Progressive Islam, Syed Alatas draws from Ibn Khaldun, what he refers to as the socio-historical method. And again, we'll see that contemporary proponents of Progressive Islam also stress the socio-historical method as far as the interpretation of Islam and the interpretation of Islamic affairs are concerned. So the socio-historical method, as applied to the study of Islam and Muslim societies, requires a consideration of the following factors: the culture and civilization in which a particular system was born, the age in which it occurred, the area to which it was related, the individual or group who initiated the system, the situation in which the individual or group found themselves when they commenced advocating that system, the class to which the individual or group belonged, and the personality of the founder. So these refer to various aspects of the historical situation or the socio-historical location of a religion, of a religious law, of a religious idea, that what we now call maqasid sharia is actually inextricably bound in with the socio-historical situation or context of not just revelation, but also rules and regulations, man-made rules and regulations, man-made ideas, not just Quranic revelation, but what is also man-made, also has to be understood in terms of the historical and social context. And I'll give some examples of that later. Another, and I think this also illustrates the feature of progressive Islam, that it very much straddles the Islamic tradition as well as other traditions. So in the case of Alatas, he drew from Ibn Khaldun for the socio-historical approach, but he was very much influenced, and he states that much, he was very much influenced by the thinking of Karl Mannheim, who also, who pioneered the sociology of knowledge approach. And this was in fact a major, it was the foundation of Alatas' work on the myth of the lazy native. Now, it wasn't till about 50 years later that the term and idea of progressive Islam re-emerged in the, as I said, around 2000, 2001, 2002. In 2003, Omid Safi, a prominent proponent of progressive Islam, describes it in the following manner: progressive Islam encompasses a number of themes striving to realize a just and pluralistic society through a critical engagement with Islam, a relentless pursuit of social justice, an emphasis on gender equality as a foundation of human rights, and a vision of religious and ethnic pluralism. So progressive Muslims have a universal approach in that they see themselves as advocates of all human beings, not just Muslims. This also is a very important distinction, a very important factor that distinguishes progressive Muslims from other orientations. You find throughout the Muslim world, Islamic movements, whether conservative or more progressive, more moderate, more liberal, generally take up only Muslim causes and rarely take up causes of non-Muslims, even in this country. Even in this country. In this country, you have persecution, where you have, I wouldn't say persecution, but you have restrictions, sometimes very unfair restrictions, and sometimes some degree of hate speech against other religions, against Christianity, for example. Occasionally you have some Christian bashing going on in this country. You very rarely see Muslim organizations come out in full force protecting the rights of other religious communities. That's not the case in the West. In the West, you have non-Muslim groups, maybe Christian, they may be secular groups that champion the cause of other communities, including Muslims. So I think this is an important point about progressive Islam. There is also concern with subalternity in all of its forms. That is, with poverty, with oppression, and other forms of marginalization. The task of progressive Muslims is to give voice to the voiceless, power to the powerless, and confront the powers that be. Furthermore, progressive Muslims also derive their concern with social justice from both within and without the Islamic tradition, as well as modern orientations. So they draw from very diverse sources, such as the Quran and the Sunnah, the scholars of the past, modern scholars such as Ali Shariati, and this was actually mentioned by some progressive Muslims. They also enthusiastically draw from non-Muslim traditions, for example, from the Catholic liberation theology tradition. Again, I think this is something that distinguishes them from other traditions. So progressive Islam, according to Omid Safi, is therefore Islamic humanism, premised on the idea that all members of the human race have the same intrinsic worth, because each of us has the breath of God breathed into our being. وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي. That's the ayat of the Quran, right? We breathe our breath into him, into man. Now, there has been a tendency to refer to progressive Islam as an American or Western appropriation of Islam. Again, this is something that will be picked up by our authorities, by our so-called ulama and some politicians. They'll be, condemning progressive Islam, saying it's a Western idea, it's not part of Islamic tradition. So this also, we have to nip this in the bud by making this point, that it is not a Western appropriation of Islam. And there's a good quote from Omid Safi about this. Progressive Muslims are found everywhere in the global Muslim ummah. When it comes to implementing a progressive understanding of Islam in Muslim societies, groups in Iran, Malaysia, South Africa lead the United States. Many American Muslim communities and much of the leadership represented in groups such as the Islamic Circle of North America, the Islamic Society of North America, and the Council on American Islamic Relations are far too uncritical of Salafi and Wahhabi tendencies that progressive Muslims oppose. I was a student in America throughout the 1980s, from 1980 to the end of 1989. At that point, American Islam, at least among the students, the mosques, very much Ikhwan and Salafi dominated. I'm not sure what the situation now is, but it was like that. And this was with the active support of the American government, or at least parts of the American administration. And it would have been very difficult to speak of progressive Islam if you talk about at least the institutions in America. But Omid Safi is making this point 2003, which is about 15 years ago. Anyway, his main point is not to connect progressive Islam movement too closely with any single national or ethnic origin. Proponents of progressive Islam are found everywhere, and the point is not, as he says, to seek an American, an Iranian, or a South Asian origin for this discourse, but to view it as a global discourse with fluid and cosmopolitan thinkers who benefit from each other's work. Now, what I've done so far, based on the writings of progressive Muslims themselves, for example, there's a volume called Progressive Muslims, edited by Omid Safi. It has articles by Ibrahim Musa, by Ibrahim Musa and Farid and several others. And there are a few, and there's a book on progressive, the imperatives of progressive Islam by Adis Tuderja. Now, what I've done is to describe some of the ideas in progressive Islam. But now I'd like to say something about the definition of progressive Islam. How would we actually define it? Now, I think that based on what progressive Muslims believe, the orientation of progressive Islam really has to do with moderation. It takes a moderate position that even liberals do not take. But I have to explain what I mean by that. Now, because I don't have too much of time, I can't go into all the details, but let me say this. I'm defining moderation in terms of the classical approach, that moderation, or the idea of wasat, the idea of ummatan wasatan, the community of the middle way, that moderation in the classical tradition is defined in terms of justice. Or rather, justice is defined in terms of moderation. Why is that so? Justice is defined in terms of moderation because justice is defined in terms of balance. The idea of mizan. Mizan, means balance. So you have ayats in the Quran, and you have among the scholars, the classical scholars, they define justice in terms of striking a balance between extremes. So if we understand moderation in that way, as striking a balance between extremes. For example, this term, ifrat and tafrit. Are you familiar with that term? Yes? Are all of you familiar? You need to be familiar with this. It's very much part of classical Islamic tradition, right? Ifrat and tafrit. It refers to two extremes. Ifrat means excesses, and tafrit means deficiencies, laxity. So when you are very overly strict beyond what is required by law, that is ifrat. For example, you spend 24 hours in the mosque praying. This is ifrat, right? If you say no need to pray, niyat is enough, that is tafrit. So excess and deficiency, right? Now, this is part of the classical tradition, but Jamaluddin Afghani has a nice way of putting it. He defined excess or ifrat as that which challenges everything until nothing is stable. While languid fatalism, tafrit, leads to the worst form of slavery, which causes the ignorant to accept all that issues from fortune, chance, and circumstance. So you see, ifrat, challenging everything and destabilizing everything, and tafrit, just, taslim, what do you call it? You're fatalistic, you leave everything to chance and fortune. Again, two extremes. Now, so we define moderation as a balance set up between extremes in the various spheres of public and private life. Not just in theological terms, not just in legal, in the terms of the way we follow rituals, but in broader terms in both public and private life. It would then be possible for us to enumerate various such spheres in public and private life with reference to the relevant continua in each sphere. With reference to the relevant continua in each sphere. So what I mean is this. And I discussed about 7 or 8, 9, 10 continua. So when I say continua, I mean, the plural of continuum. That when we talk about balance, so I've defined moderation as striking a balance between extremes. Now, how do we understand this in practical terms? Striking balance between extremes in different areas of life, right? So when we talk about balance between extremes, we're talking about a continuum from one extreme to another. So, for example, the internal-external continuum. So progressive Muslims, as I mentioned earlier, are critical of both external factors that negatively impact on the life chances of Muslims, as well as local, domestic, and regional factors. So there is a balance between emphasizing the external factors and the internal factors. Unlike some Muslim groups who tend to blame most of the misfortunes of Muslim community on colonialism or imperialism, and pay less attention to internal factors like leadership, corruption among Muslim governments, and so on and so forth. So the progressive Muslim would tend to strike the balance between the internal and the external. Another continuum, the inclusive and exclusive. Progressive Muslims, being moderate, celebrate diversity, but are not excessively inclusive, that they would be including any and every group that claims to be Muslim. Neither are they excessively, I'm sorry, I meant to say they were not excessively inclusive to the extent that they would include any and every group. On the other hand, they are not excessively exclusive, and they generally accept as Muslims all the groups, all the schools of thought that have been accepted in the classical tradition. So, for example, unlike many Salafis, unlike many Wahhabis, unlike many Sunnis today in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in many parts of the Muslim world, who have become more exclusivist and reject certain schools of thought as part of Islam. Another continuum which I think is very important that has usually not been discussed. Progressive Muslims strike a balance between tradition and modernity. And this is an area in which progressive Muslims are significantly different from liberal Islam. And I'll explain more about that later. But progressive Muslims remain rooted in tradition intellectually and culturally while engaging with the modern world and benefiting from the intellectual and cultural resources that modernity has to offer. Progressive Muslims are not traditionalistic in the sense of clinging on to tradition when it is dysfunctional. Neither are they modernistic in the sense of rejecting or repudiating tradition by writing it off as an innovation, or bid'ah. Where progressive Muslims differ from Muslims of other orientation is their more postmodernist attitude. They're being mindful and critical, as one of them said. They're being mindful and critical of the arrogance of modernity. This refers to the Western view that it's, the arrogance of modernity is the idea that Western civilization represents the telos of history. That is the final state in which humankind has reached the limits of its social, economic, and cultural development. So this idea is rejected by progressive Muslims. It is not an idea which is criticized by liberal Islam. So liberal Muslims, so-called liberal Muslims, whether those who are labeled as liberal Muslims or those who call themselves liberal Muslims, tend not to be as critical of modernity as progressive Muslims. And I think this is an important distinction. Another continuum where progressive Muslims try to strike the balance between extremes is the esoteric-exoteric divide, the Zahir-Batin divide. So the entrenchment of legalistic thinking among the ulama and people in general has led to a de-emphasis on ethics and morality, spirituality and religious experience. There is a lack of balance between the need to adhere to rituals, rules and regulations on the one hand, and the spiritual experience of worship and other human activities. This we see very clearly in Malaysia, right? Increasingly more attention to rules, regulations and rituals. To the extent now, it is not only being advised, the emphasis is not only through advice, it is through policing. Which is not even part of Islamic tradition, one can argue. People engaged in Christian bashing talk about Christianization in Malaysia. I would argue that our religious authorities are Christianizing Islam. How are they doing that? By engaging in Inquisition-type activities, which the modern world learned from the Christian inquisitors, going into people's house, checking whether they have they really converted to Christianity, from Jews and Muslims in Spain, did they really convert to Christianity, testing them. This is not part of Islamic tradition. But this is what Daesh does. They stop people on the road in Syria or Iraq and ask them to read something from the Quran to find out whether they are Christians or Muslims, or they'll check whether so-and-so is a Shiite, right? This is not really part of Islamic tradition. We have instances of it throughout history, but it's not institutionalized. And we are institutionalizing that. So this is really the secular, the idea of intelligence, gathering information, interrogation. This is the modern state. And the modern state, these ideas come from the Inquisition. So, they are right. We have to be aware of Christianization. But, what is actually the Christianization going on and who is doing it? I have discussed a few other continuum, but I won't go into the details. The non-rational, rational continuum. Again, progressive Muslims try to strike that balance. They are not, they are not against intuition. They're not against non-rational sources of knowledge and inspiration, but they don't see a contradiction between the two sides. So you could say that the more modernist, liberal Salafis would be more critical of the non-rational elements in Islamic tradition. So again, this is where they differ from the liberals. The freedom-coercion continuum. the nationalist, imperialist continuum, and the this worldly, other worldly continuum. So in all these areas, progressive Muslims attempt to strike a balance. Now, I just want to say a few things about the tradition-modernity continuum and the approach of progressive Islam. Now, and this I think is something specific to the Malaysian case. It may also be something that is found in a few other Muslim countries, not all Muslim countries. I had mentioned this during my remarks last night. Now, as I said earlier, progressive Islam attempts to strike a balance between tradition and modernity. It is critical of both tradition and modernity. It also appreciates tradition and appreciates aspects of modernity. Now, I want to give an example of progressive Islam's critique of tradition, right? And this is something that we rarely do in Malaysia. Now, one of our scholars, Dr. Shaharuddin Ma'ruf, has an interesting analysis that provides progressive Muslims with a useful means of appropriating from tradition, of distinguishing what is positive and negative about our tradition. So Shaharuddin defines tradition as cultural or value systems which have been influential in molding or shaping the worldview of a given people for a significant period in their cultural history. These cultural or value systems represent the stable core which provides the basis for the society's response to contemporary and future challenges. Tradition can be a negative or positive factor in the development of a society. So when we talk about the Malay world, we can see that there are two opposing traditions in Malay society. There is the feudal, more hierarchical tradition, and the Islamic or more egalitarian tradition. So how do we define feudal values? Right? So we look at our Malay tradition. We have the feudal tradition, and in conflict with that, but coexisting, we have the Islamic tradition. So how do we define the feudal tradition? So the feudal tradition includes the following values: servile attitude towards authority and the acceptance of arbitrary notions of power. The undermining of the positive aspects of individualism and therefore the lack of respect for the human personality. The lack of respect for the rule of law. The non-distinction between the public domain and the personal domains of life. The emphasis on grandeur and opulent lifestyle. The indifference to social justice. The acceptance of unfair privileges for those in positions of power. Now, we know a lot about that, right? The obsession with power, authority, and privileges for their own sake. The undervaluing of rationalism and the philosophical spirit, and the encouragement of myths which serve the interests of those in power. And finally, the emphasis on leisure and indulgence of the senses, and the simultaneous undervaluing of work. So these feudal values, and I think we can all recognize them because these are the values that, were the core of feudal society in the past, in the pre-colonial and even in the colonial period, because the British actively supported the feudal elite. But we can see that in Malaysia today, although the feudal system is no longer there, the values are still there. All these values, undermining of, the lack of respect for the human personality, servile attitude towards authority. Anyone living in Malaysia knows this. If you live in a neighborhood where there are not enough of Datos and Tan Sris, it's very hard to get services. You call DBKL to fix a broken pipe, they will take days to come. But if you are living in a neighborhood where there's Tan Sris, they will come very fast. This is feudalistic mentality, right? The emphasis or obsession with grandeur and opulent lifestyle, etc., etc. So we are very familiar with this. So the feudal values are not only at odds with the spirit and outlook of modernization, but also clash with the fundamental values of Islam. So as opposed to feudal values, Islamic tradition emphasizes more rational and egalitarian conception of authority, limiting arbitrary power, the recognition of positive individual and respect for the human personality, the rule of law, a more humanistic conception of leadership, ethical integrity, honesty in public office, frugality, social justice, philosophical spirit, and so on and so forth. Now, I think it's important to also realize that in our tradition, it is not that the people who are informed or who are guided by feudal values are not Muslims. It's not that kind of divide, right? Among Muslims, you have those that are more feudalistic in their outlook, and you have those who are more egalitarian in their outlook. Sometimes Islam is interpreted in a feudalistic manner. For example, you know the scholar Nuruddin Araniri. Nuruddin Araniri was, I think you all know, yes? Was it 17th century in Aceh? Now, he was Sheikhul Islam, in charge of religious affairs under the state during the reign of at least one of the sultanas of Aceh, because Aceh had, I think, 4 sultanas who were ruling. There was no male ruler. There was no sultan. They were the rulers. A colleague of mine, Sherbanu Akhtar Khan, has just published a book on the sultanas of Aceh. Now, Raniri was apparently against the Wujudiyah teachings of Hamza Fansuri and the followers of Hamza Fansuri. And apparently, according to what I read, Raniri had actively persecuted the followers of the Wujudiyah when he was Sheikhul Islam. So here you have, and he's a Muslim of course, but then here you have a more feudalistic kind of approach, right? So within this, among Muslims, among Malays and even other Muslims, you will find both a feudalistic approach, attitude, outlook on life, as opposed to, and as well as a more egalitarian, rational, philosophical approach. Now, the question that we will ask ourselves today in Malaysia, for example, which tradition of Islam, which tradition among the Malays dominates? Is it the egalitarian tradition or is it the feudal tradition? So the question of progressive Islam in Malaysia, the question of moderate Islam in Malaysia, the question of the relationship between Islam and the state, the question of the development of Islam within civil society as well as at the state level, has to revolve around this issue. The issue of whether our tradition is more feudalistic, and if it is, what do we do about it? I just want to end my last point, because I was speaking about the ideas of progressive Islam, but I want to make one point now about the method of progressive Islam. Earlier on I had said that progressive Islam is about the uses the socio-historical method. Now we talk about maqasid sharia, or we talk about, what's the other term, what do you call it, asbab and nuzul, right? The context of revelation. Now, the socio-historical method really refers to the maqasid sharia and to asbab and nuzul, right? It's talking about the context of revelation. Although the early scholars who talked about the context of revelation were perhaps less tuned to the socio-historical dimension of the context. But particularly after the work of Ibn Khaldun, and then after the development of the sociology of knowledge, we have better insights into what we mean by the context of revelation, by the asbab and nuzul. But even before the term socio-historical method was used, we have examples of how that method was applied. And contrary to what some of the ulama would say, that it is modern and liberal and Western to give a context, to explain that a certain rule or regulation in Islam no longer applies. contrary to that view, it is part of our tradition. And I just want to give one example from Ibn Khaldun. There is a hadith which says that the leaders of the Muslims, in other words, the Khalifa, must come from the Bani Quraysh. Right? This is a Sahih hadith and is known. Everybody knows this. Now, for most of Islamic history, the Khalifas were not from the Bani Quraysh. Right? Yet, the entire Muslim world, for example, accepted the Ottomans as the Khalifa. The Ottoman sultans were accepted as Khalifa. Now, how is this to be explained? It can only be explained in terms of the socio-historical method. And Ibn Khaldun does this. So Ibn Khaldun says that rule, well, let me just, what does he say? Yeah. So Ibn Khaldun deals with the religious requirement that the Khalif must come from the Quraysh. So the argument was that the requirement that the Khalifa must come from the Quraysh, the requirement only held, the requirement was only required to be fulfilled when the asabiyah or the solidarity of the Quraysh was intact. The necessary condition was that the caliphate was to be in the hands of the group that possessed superior solidarity, superior asabiyah. When rule passed from the Arabs to the Turks, it was the Turks that possessed superior asabiyah. The Quraysh could no longer satisfy the condition. Therefore, the condition was dropped. Very sensible. If the empire, if the Muslim world is under the rule of the Ottomans, it is ridiculous to then expect that somebody from the Bani Quraysh becomes a Khalifa. It becomes a ridiculous requirement, and in fact it is against the interest of the Muslim community, because the requirement, as Ibn Khaldun says, is that the group that commands the greatest solidarity should lead, should provide leadership, right? So this is just an example of the application of the socio-historical method to understand religious rules and regulations. Okay, I'm concluding now. Now, in the rest of the paper goes on for another 15 pages or so. I discuss, in what I've discussed so far, I talked about the meaning, definition of progressive Islam and the method. In the next section, which I will not discuss, I talk about the conception of a progressive society derived from Ibn Khaldun's critique of already existing societies. So I'm saying that Ibn Khaldun's discussion, his critique of contemporary societies during his time, gives us a way of understanding what he means by a moderate, or what we would call a progressive society. For example, Ibn Khaldun was highly critical of government being involved in business. Among other things, he said it removed incentives from the private sector. It also drove up prices, and many other reasons that he gave. So if you look at his critique of Muslim society during his time, we can extract a notion of what a progressive society means. So it is not a utopian, idealistic notion. It is something based on the reality of his time. So I discussed that. And then in the final section in the paper, I discussed the view that progressive Islam is about reform, but it is not about Protestant type reform. Again, this is something that we need to make clear, because the authorities will be claiming that we are Christianizing and Westernizing, and we are asking for reform, meaning Protestant type reform, Protestant Islam. And in fact, the label has already been used on some people in the past. Abdul Karim Suruj was referred to the Islamic Luther, for example. Ali Shariati himself had used the term Islamic Protestantism. So in this last section, I had clarified that when Muslims speak about reform, they are not talking about a Protestant type reform, and there are reasons why we make that distinction, because there are the parallels between what we are trying to do now and what the Protestant Reformation was about are not that close that warrants our referring to Protestantizing Islam. So to conclude, 3 points. Progressive Islam is not liberal Islam. Not that I'm against, liberal Muslims, as people, as we say, some of my best friends are liberals. But I think that, intellectually speaking, I think liberal Islam or liberal Muslims tend to be more accepting of modernity than progressive Muslims. I think one of the critiques of progressive Muslims with regard to modernity has to do with the problem of nihilism. It goes beyond the critique of secularism to the critique of nihilism as a condition of modernity. Progressive Muslims are perhaps less critical or more accepting of modernity in comparison to the postmodernist approach towards modernity, which is something that progressive Muslims would adopt. So that's one point. The second point is that sorry, I have 4 points. The second point is just to repeat that we're not trying to make any claims here, and we're not trying to outdo others. But it is nice for us, especially in our pessimistic context in Malaysia, nice for us to think that at least the idea of progressive Islam did emerge from among us, and it's our tradition. It's part of the tradition of the Malay world, and let's elaborate on it and further develop it. The third point is that the stumbling block to that is our leadership, right? Leadership, I think, is key to our problem. Religious leadership, political leadership, and I don't only refer to leadership at that level, but also in civil society, right? At all levels. And finally, the last point. We've been talking about civil society, civil Islam, and political and progressive Islam. Now, I just wanted to clarify that these are two different things. Progressive Islam refers to an orientation, a way of thinking. Civil Islam refers to the sphere of activity. So the two are not the same. So presumably in the religious civil society, civil Islam refers to the sphere of religion outside of the state, right? So presumably within civil Islam, in the sphere of religious activity outside of the state, you would have progressive Islam, you could have Salafi Islam, you could have liberal Islam, you can have different orientations, right? We are not to claim and to say that within civil society there is only space for progressive Islam. There is space for all orientations within Islam, one of them being progressive Islam. Thank you very much.